So welcome everyone to this seminar, and welcome to Susanna Hecht for our first seminar of this series. So it's a great pleasure to have you here and to have you talk. And we'll have time for questions and answers afterwards. Can I ask anybody listening in to please make sure your microphone is muted, and at the end, when we have a Q&A, I would encourage you to switch on your videos and ask your questions directly to Susanna at the end. So over to you.
Great. Well, first of all, it's an honor. And I last saw Jair, I think in January of this year, at a meeting in which there was another Amazonian meeting in which many of the indigenous population leaders were there. And I hate to report that several of them have died since of COVID, or their relatives have died, but most importantly, Payakan and Kayapo. So it's important to understand that what we're talking about takes place in a kind of a lethal environment, and that this is not one of the great moments in Amazon. As a historian of the Amazon, let me tell you, this is not one of the great moments in Amazonian history. You know, it's not like a triumphalist. You don't have a feeling of triumphalism. So let me just give you a little bit of a sense of where I'm going to go with this. I'm going to talk a lot about the state and state making, how it was that Amazonian deforestation declined. It was a little bit of a shimmer, as I'll show, but then, but still not nothing because of the institutionalities. And then, of course, we get the entrance of Jair Bolsonaro and the triumph of the ruralist coterie within the politics. But this coincides also with a much higher dependence of the Brazilian state, and in fact, all of the Amazonian states, on Amazonian commodities. So instead of having kind of industrial development that was supposed to happen as a consequence of investment and all that stuff in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, what you have had is a resurgence and a reversion to a kind of dependent development, or I'm not even sure we can call it development anymore, a transformation of the economy from, how shall we say, a modernizing economy into a sort of proto-colonial supplier of raw materials. I wish I weren't saying it, and I feel like I'm throwing a lot of, how to say, cliches at you, but I think there's been a very important structural shift over the last 50 years. And one of the things about it has been moving away from a diversified economy into one really emphasizing extraction and sale of raw materials and investments to enhance that. So let me just go along here. Here's a nice forest. And what's really nice about this is that this is a production.
You're going to presentation mode, Susanna?
I think I am. No?
No, you're. Can you click on slideshow in the bottom right, or from the menu?
Let's see. But
further to the right. That's it.
Further to the right.
That's
here.
It. Yeah. No, you were there. You were there just before.
There. Here.
Yeah.
Ooh. Oh yeah. There we go. Sorry. There. So you can see here that what's nice about this is that this is in fact an acai forest with cacao underneath, fisheries nearby. It's a complex production forest that has a lot of functionality and the structure that has maintained life and livelihood in Amazonia for quite some time. So let me talk a little bit about where I'm going to go. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about this shift from authoritarian to democratic states and what that's meant. I think we sort of forget how young these states are, and as a consequence, how vulnerable they are. And that also that the sort of expansion of democratic states, although deforestation wasn't absent, it meant that there were many other kinds of ways of getting accountability and control over processes. The other thing is that the globalization also was globalization from below and globalization of ideas, as well as this dynamic of globalization from above. The other thing, for those of you who are readers and Amazonian devotees, is that there's always this attention to one or two policies that is the kind of silver bullet approach, that if we just stop this, it would stop everything. And the reality is that it's more like whack-a-mole than like getting a good policy. So the thing is that by focusing on singular policies rather than multiple modernities, we've kind of missed an important political chance. So the one sort of classic thing that has been, inundating a lot of the literature is, of course, the importance of the soy moratorium, which in a much larger context misses the larger context that made it possible, and also misses the fact that there were other things that were going on that made it look less important if you cared about other kinds of forests besides Amazonia. So it sort of embodies the sacred grove, sacrifice zone ideology that has sort of covered the development of Amazonia. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about 1988, and I'm going to talk about it as the long 1988. I picked this year in part because sometimes there are pivotal years in which many, many things change. And so the point about this is that there are a bunch of sort of zeitgeist things. And I'm taking the long 1988, which means to 1990. Historians do this, they say, well, it all didn't happen in that period. But one of the things that's important in this period is that, and you'll see that these are all kind of big shifts that don't really have to do with Amazonia, but have to do with the way that people think about Amazonia and insert Amazonia into these larger questions. So one is the creation of the IPCC and the famous James Hansen presentation about climate change to the American Congress, showing the dynamics of this and the dangers that inhere in it. And of course, this is the year of the formation of the IPCC, which starts to become this institution that, as it goes along, starts identifying more and more the importance of Amazonia in how you would think about dealing with the questions of climate change. Another thing is the end of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union. So what this meant was kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't want to call it the end of history. I think we've had quite a bit of history since then. But the point is that it ends the Cold War, which kind of reduces the American interest in Latin America in a lot of ways. It was interested in it more for hegemonic reasons, for the Monroe Doctrine. It had had all these wars going on in Central America, and as a way of blocking the kinds of politics of redistribution that had inhered in some of the Cold War politics of Latin America. As many of you know, the United States was very much behind the implementation of the authoritarian regime in Brazil. So there was kind of, once the Soviet Union goes away, and the Cold War is over, the interest sort of for the United States shifts to the Middle East. The other thing that's important about this, so that's a very important kind of ideological and hegemonic shift that occurs, and into that void moves China. China comes in as now permitted into the WTO in 1989. And what happens in that is that it starts to be a world market player with its extraordinary commodities. One of the things that's important is that it begins to start importing soybeans from Brazil in the early 90s, but it also began selling industrial products. So while we in the United States are always, in a lather about China these days, and the Chinese globalization, and its undermining of our industrial system, in newly industrializing and newly emerging economies like that of Brazil, the China shock was extreme. It really undermined their industrial economy in a very profound way. So it's important to understand that these large-scale macroeconomic dynamics began to sort of shift to what we might call the areas in which China was most interested in purchasing materials and engaging in these areas, which was less importing t-shirts, because they make great t-shirts and sell them all over the world, but rather more into raw materials throughout Amazonia. The other thing was a big shift in macro policy at the sort of international organization level, and a shift from ISI, import substitution industrial development, into what's called structural adjustment, the Washington Consensus, which then is what we sort of know as neoliberalism. It just means opening your economy a lot, decentralizing it, marketizing it, and instead of using the state as an apparatus for development, you use markets. It's not entirely that simple, but the point is that at the level of macro policy, it really shifts dramatically. And this is part of the dynamic that occurs. One of the things that also happened was, in part, this issue of environmental conditionality on international loans. So if you were getting stuff from the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank, you had to deal with the environmental consequences of what you were about to do. So this was a new thing. So you could sort of think of this moment as being the sort of unholy alliance, or the unholy offspring, or the holy offspring between environmentalism and neoliberalism, in the sort of creation of a kind of a universe which creates these conditions of possibility. What's also important at this time is at the internationalization of environmental politics within a national development framework. So there's a lot of money for developing sustainable development ministries, and ministries that look at environment and so on, and that manage environment in a different way. So instead of what you had previously, which was the Forest Service or the Agricultural Ministry, there start to be these new environmental ministries, and they are quite important, as we'll see. In the Brazilian context, what you see is that you have the ascendance into politics of a lot of globalized frameworks. So what I mean by that is that Brazilians begin to start seeing themselves as not an autarkic or sort of sitting to the side, but it's responding to a lot of globalized frameworks. The other thing is the rise of human rights politics, particularly as this pertains to indigenous rights. I've mentioned environmental politics as a regional and global enterprise. So one of the things is you start to see capital flows and aid flows that specifically don't go to, let's say, road building, but rather to environmental organizations, both as franchises from international organizations, as well as you might as autochthonous organizations and support. So what you start to see is the emergence of a kind of financial apparatus around environmental politics. One of the other things, of course, is that environmental stuff begins to imply financial levers, so that you can get in a lot of trouble with your international bankers if you're not behaving correctly. And so you start to politicize the supply chain. It's always been politicized, of course, but what happens is that the environmental concern starts to be part of that political side, supply chain. And of course, the 1985 brouhaha, the whole question of stopping the loans to the road and so on, these become important questions. And also, if you're looking for international money for things like dams, it becomes important to respond to these financial levers. The other thing about this is the rise of constitutions, and what the anthropologists John Komaroff and Jean Komaroff call the constitutionality period. And what you have, and the reason I focus on Brazil, is Brazil was sort of the first to sit down and start writing a new constitution. Remember, they'd had an authoritarian regime that had sort of said, well, you know, we get to do whatever we want. sort of what we're looking forward to in the United States these days. But the point here is really that there was there had been repression of civil society. The state had been an apparatus that had to be completely reconfigured, and markets were sort of the one thing that was sort of operating in the universe. So essentially what you have is the beginning of the development of new constitutions. Now, most of us sit in countries that aren't writing new constitutions all the time, but this sort of sets off a spate of writing of constitutions for the countries involved in Amazonia. So Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, Colombia goes through a bunch of these. But the point is that you have a shift away from authoritarian regimes into new kinds of ones, new kinds of democratic regimes, and these in principle follow the ideas of the Washington Consensus. They decentralize the management of the economy in regions. They open the economies a lot, so that means that there's sort of competitive dynamics, and many of these economies, for a number of reasons, a lot having to do with corruption, were not particularly economically competitive except in natural resources, and restructuring the state is very important. What's also specifically important about this restructuring is, one, there's environmental language in it, as I say in the first bullet point here, but very importantly was the recognition of historical rights of traditional populations. So what this means is that instead of having to refer back to 1850, which is where the previous land politics resided and land rights resided, you could invoke history. And also what was important about that, you could say, well, we've occupied this for so and so much time, and we have, we can talk to you about what that territory is to us and how long we've occupied it. So it's the idea of historical rights rather than state legal rights that become important in this, and there's a number of dimensions to this. The other thing that's really important about this, and I think sometimes we forget, is that what this also did is that it's changed the episteme of conservation from one of a set-aside into one of inhabited environments, which is an epistemic and political change that's monumental. And what it does, of course, is it makes that form of conservation, it breaks open the idea of conservation into a much more historically rooted and complexly analyzed form of conservation, rather than just saying, well, there's the theory of island biogeography and they just need to be big and we'll forget about it. So it changes the way of thinking about Amazonia in a spatial, political, and ecological way. The other thing that's important about this historical rights is that it had within it the idea of multiple modernities, so that you could be engaged, you could have your little cell phone, here we have it, but be living in, so you could get the prices, you could meet people, you could organize your transportation of your product. There's lots of things that you could do in this kind of thing, but you wouldn't have to be hooked in to the modernist dreamscape of authoritarianism and the modernist dreamscape more generally for the region, which was annual cropping systems or pastures, low biodiversity, open landscapes, and low labor absorption. That's a feature of modernity, and essentially linked to monocropping. So the modernist landscape under this kind of, under the military and what comes later is what we think of as, agro-industry monocropping. Now, Brazil has a long history in agro-industry, some 500 years, so they're not bad at taking something complex and turning it into a simple system. And as I say, they've had a lot of practice. But you'll see that one of the things about the traditional populations was the idea that you could be engaged in a modern world and global products and so on, but you wouldn't have to necessarily engage in the modernist vision or necessarily in the modern social relations uniquely based on wages, structured along the lines of the corporation. And last but not least, of course, this long 1988 involves the creation of the internet. So this is a lot that happens in the space of a couple of years that really changes how Amazonia is inserted into the world. So let's go take a look. One thing that happens is that you start to get the recomposition of the state. I'm not going to go into it too much, but you also get the emergence of green markets. That this is what I mean by multiple modernities. You get green governance, you get different ways of organizing the management of these regions, and also you get the emergence of environmental markets, payment for environmental services, and so on. You're also getting the rise of social movements, which are now permitted to be in place, and also the areas, you get a lot of migration, you're getting a lot of urbanization, and the place is really changing. It's now moving, being seen less as some kind of, place at the ends of the earth and beginnings of time, but rather as integrated into markets. I've already sort of gone through most of these, but what I would like to also mention here as a function of these other things is the science-inflected development began under the military regime. It started with their interest in basically large-scale resource survey. But what happened is that basically science became, the military were positivists. They saw themselves as being not driven by the vulgar exigencies of corruption, although of course there's always that, but that they were going to do a kind of development that was scientifically informed. And this is sort of a feature of Latin American positivism. And also that there was really a big shift from sort of the boy's own natural history stories to a more focused science that was using different kinds of technologies. Partly this is a function of the development of computer capacity, the enhanced use of remote sensing, the use of a panopticon, that is in-place satellite, so that you could have continuous monitoring, the rise of climate change science and politics that begins to really move this along, and also intellectually and in the sort of scientific analytic world, the rise of the idea of environmental services as having value, not sort of as being a platform on which human history could be inscribed, and also the idea of ecological economics, and that actually started to have to account for some of these things. So it's a very important shift, and it's almost impossible to imagine how dramatic that is, except while one was living through it, you didn't even really notice it too much. But as you look back in hindsight, these periods are like this is like a tectonic or quantum change in terms of the way that Amazonia is conceptualized and thought about. Well, I thought I would put this in. This on the right side is the American Constitutional Convention. And you'll know what I really like about this is that they're all wearing wigs and sort of dressed the same. Whereas on the left side, you have basically Kayapo or Jair Indians also wearing uniform head outfits, much more handsome, it has to be said, because they're mostly green parrot feathers, but those beautiful Amazonian headdresses. So this is at the Constitutional Convention, and it's just merely a contrast between sort of the slaveholding white men and the demand by indigenous populations for their right to be citizens and their rights to their land. There's a lot of things that go on. I've mentioned most of these. I'm just going to go over this. But what happens is that you have a transition period. There's a corrupt government that shifts. You can't just go from authoritarianism into democracy. These things take time. So what begins to happen is that you have, and this is also what I always talk about, is like people think that there's just one or two policies, but the point is that all the stuff I've been talking about sort of lies behind these. So the protected area expansion is great, both of indigenous reserves, extractive reserves, sustainability reserves, and purely protected areas, national park type areas, expands dramatically. The other thing is that you begin to see enforcement of laws. Amazonia is famous for not enforcing laws, and it's sort of gone back to having no law in a lawless land now, because essentially for reasons that I'll go to in a minute. You also had the blacklisting of top deforesters. So what that meant is that if you, from the ability to observe these, you could see who was doing more illegal deforesting, you could cut them off in the sense that you could say, well, you can't get any more credit. The people are not going to take your product. So that by blacklisting, you basically used a strong censure of the most strong type, which is economic censure, in order to get compliance, as well as other forms of compliance. And then you get the soy moratorium in this latter part here. What's really important is, of course, if you look on the thing here, from 2004 to about 2015, or 14 is usually that you get a real major decade in which you have this dramatic decline in deforestation. Now, there are lots of things that go into that. Again, the point that I'm making in the back, but by recognizing traditional holdings, by doing better monitoring, you're also enhancing a lot of the science on Amazonia by using by enforcing your laws and creating new mechanisms, economic mechanisms through which you begin to try and control the supply chain is a massive kind of change. There are other kinds of things too. You have these again start to be using the idea that agricultural production and intensification begins to uncouple from deforestation. So what you would have here is this dynamic of increasing the value of agricultural products, but while you follow that old curve from 2004, this stops at 2010, but it continues out. In fact, this continues up, that somehow you've gone into a kind of a transition, a quote, land-sparing transition. I'll tell you it's not. And this is a function of several things, including zero deforestation commodities, the intention under globalization to supply chains. Again, we keep coming up with this thing about this whole issue of new forms of territoriality and tenure that protect land. And there's lots of studies that show how these new forms really are extremely effective. And then, of course, you have the institutions and the technical capacities to monitor and enforce. And part of that is a function of the mobilization of civil society, but it's also a function of creating state capacity. And often we sort of forget that state capacity is not a trivial thing. We'll see. So the result of all of this, so here we are in 2014, actually, I think this is a 2012 map, is that you have an Amazonia overall that has about 60% of its area under various forms of protected areas. These could be indigenous lands, traditional occupation, territory, quilombos, classic conservation things. So it's an extraordinary map. If you think about from 1988, and remember, these things are not instantaneous. I know we like to think that everything's instantaneous, but in the space of a generation, you've basically done there's an extraordinary dynamic of forest preservation that goes on in this new idiom. So that epistemic change about occupied lands as being valued conservation areas becomes really important. So, well, it's 1914, and there are political changes in the wind, and this just gives you a sort of more dramatic view of this. There's a coup about to happen, or a change to happen here, where well, first of all, Brazil is the darling of the Paris Accords, but what is looming on the front there is the end of the PT hegemony in politics and the rise of Temer, who, in order not to be immediately impeached and convicted of corruption, becomes, if you will, a kind of henchman for the agro-industrial and mining elites, and for also the construction elites. And by the way, the construction industries are famous for their corruption. And if you look across Pan-Amazonia, those Odebrecht scandals brought down government after government after government. It's really a remarkable story. I don't know whether one could go and find a nice conspiracy about it, but the point is that they offered so much money and everybody took it. Okay, well, we have this nice thing here that makes it seem like deforestation is going down. And it is going down in places like Mato Grosso, but it's not going down in lots of other places. It's slowing in Amazonia, but it's not, and in Brazilian Amazonia, which has all that institutional capacity, as we've discussed, but that's not the only thing that's going on. So one of the questions is the dynamics of leakage. One is that we start with Jevons parent, so rather than going with the Borlaug hypothesis, which is constantly thrown at you by the soy moratorium people, which is that it's land sparing. By intensification, you use less land and thus land is spared. That would be one thing if you were in a steady state economy and not in a sector that was highly expansionist, as was the soy and agro industry. So even if you're more efficient and more profitable, in fact, the land use itself can explode, not because it's less efficient, but because it's more efficient and more profitable. So just because you are more efficient doesn't give you land, or intensifying doesn't give you land sparing, not in an expansionary sector. The other thing is that what we see also is that the representation of Amazonia, in which all of us are implicated, I'm afraid, is that there's really a lot of natural value and iconic value, symbolic value in Amazonia, and historical value in ways that if I say Chiquitania to you, most of you will go, huh? Isn't that some kind of epidemic thing? No, that's Chichingunga. No, I mean, you see what I mean. The Caatinga, most of you won't know about it, or many of you will because you're interested in these questions. But essentially, you have a very important, very valued landscape with a lot of institutions and a lot of mobilization to protect it, whereas in the Cerrado, the Caatinga, Chiquitania, the Mata Atlantica in Paraguay, and secondary forests all over the place. These are all areas that have human occupation, by the way. So it's not as if these are areas that are, they have, if you will, sort of the taint of human action, and not in a poetic way, like indigenous people or rubber tappers, but in a kind of peasanty way. Also, they're undervalued because they're only now we're beginning to see how extremely interesting and complex these ecosystems are, and not the least of their important value as we start to go into this really intensive moment of climate change, when actually plants and animals well adapted to high levels of heat and drought might be sort of an interesting set of questions to look at. And also, you know, there's up to side down forests in the sense that a lot of their carbon is underground, not above carbon. Anyway, there's a lot of things about these that I won't go into, but what happens is that those are seen as expendable forests, while Amazonia sort of sits in this luster that it always has and that it always enjoys. The other thing is, of course, indirect land use change starts to push into Amazonia. So even though you have a kind of a nice look for Mato Grosso, it doesn't look so great as you move into Rondônia. It doesn't look all that great in Pará. So what happens is that you begin to start to see indirect land use change. It's not necessarily driven by the idea for high production landscapes, but more for speculation, as has always been the case, for money laundering, gold, timber, and coca, for land capture, for future assets and land grabbing, so that as intensification happens, it kind of pushes the less intensive stuff forward. The other thing is that investors who are in this highly regulated areas start to look for less regulated areas. These are what are called pollution havens elsewhere, but these are unregulated havens. They don't have the institutionality, they don't have the observation, they don't have the monitoring, and so this lack of institutional density permits the easy mobility of capital and soy farming systems that, not surprisingly, move into places like Bolivia, Paraguay, and mainly those, the Chaco in Bolivia. The other thing is that you start to get a lot of rent seeking, so that what happens is that you get a lot of speculation, but also that you use the state to supply a lot of institutional rents, such as research, such as credit, such as roads. So one of the things that you begin to see is a transit from soy beef away from areas with high institutionalities and regulation, that kind of thing. So you start to see what is called leakage. And if you look at that, what you see is that the soy period and this, what looked like it was the decoupling of agricultural production from deforestation, isn't really going on. Essentially what's happening is it's displaced deforestation. And then the other thing is, of course, in 2019, we get the shift in regulatory framing with Bolsonaro, who's, you know, the thing about authoritarians, they always tell you what you're going to do. One should never think of it as just rhetoric. And the increased transformation of what had been perceived as illegal clearing into legal form. But anyway, so let me just show you a few things about, a few slides about leakage. And Mato Piba is the area that is Maranhão, Tocantins, Piauí, and Bahia. It's a new regional development area which has basically taken up, is one of the areas of soybean expansion. So part of this, if you start to look at this leakage thing, what you start to see is around 2004, they go up, while of course in Amazonia, the curve is going the other direction. You have a lot of problems of illegal deforestation in Bolivia, moving primarily into Santa Cruz and the Beni. Again, this is a sort of soybean deal. And again, it involves a lot of Brazilian capital. And this is the Chaco, this is the Paraguayan Chaco, and the Bolivian Chaco. And what you can see is a very, this is really gridded out, and this has obviously been something that has been extremely well thought out. And it avoids basically, this is an area in which there is no governance but the governance of capital. There's general shifts in the climate. So I've given you sort of the rumblings on the rumblings coming through here. What you have, of course, is big shifts in the political climate, moving away from the sort of what we call neo-extractivism, where essentially there's redistributive policies, both in agrarian reform, but particularly in conditional cash transfers. But the other thing is that you get a real problem because of corruption scandals, because of economic problems, an emergence of flailing states. And what that means is that there's, particularly in the Andean Amazon, for a number of reasons, I'm not talking about Andean Amazon, you get the emergence of a kind, I don't want to say Wild West, but unregulated dynamics of occupation. Partly this is a result of the failure of other development policies and parts of the economy. So I mentioned the China shock, the increase in the tertiary sector, the extraordinary increase in precarity. One of the things is, even though Gini coefficients have been going down, that is a measure of inequality, land Gini coefficients are much higher. They're, and that the other thing is, even as some, these are the questions of precarity and how well your income is, how you have to produce your income becomes really problematic. So one of the things is the flight into clandestine economies, gold, working in the timber industry, and also in the coca industry as well. And the other thing is, where you can, grabbing land, and this goes from small farmers to large estates at all scales, for a form of asset creation because of this dynamic of increasing infrastructure in these regions. So the other thing is that the state capacity to actually control, or its desire to control, goes down. So what we have now, as we emerge into the latter part of the 20th century, or 21st century, the beginning of the 21st century, and particularly this decade, is a rise of what I call Amazonia ascendancy. That is, before, Amazonia was like an ultra-periphery or semi-periphery, or whatever the language is. But in terms of the economy, in terms of the development dynamics, it was seen as like kind of an off thing. It's like not that important, it's kind of exotic, but it's not really substantive. But now what you see is that these economies have 30 to 40, or in the case of Ecuador, 80% of their GDP, and certainly their export, their foreign exchange, coming out of Amazonia. So that its role in the national economies and in the political economy is much, much different than it was. So it's important to keep, and I mentioned here the double shock of China. And also what happens is that, I don't like the term hegemony so much, but that China becomes the central lending agent and the central market. So we've had a major, profound structural shift. China, as you know, doesn't have dependency. The loans don't carry with them conditionalities, except, give us all your resources. And I know I feel like I'm China bashing, I don't mean to. But the point is that the issues of human rights, the issues of environment, those aren't really part and parcel of those loans as they became in the multilateral lending agencies, or if you're getting money from Europe, they're always making a fuss about that. Whereas the Chinese just say, just take the money, do what you want. And we don't really care about environment, and we don't care about monitoring deforestation particularly either. So what we now have, if we start to look at this from 2019, so this is our low period. This is the period when what happens is, this is in Brazil, you're getting rid of Mr. Temer. This is the sort of period of transition from of democratic regimes and the rise of the ruralist agro-industry complex. There's so much political turmoil. There isn't very much monitoring. There's monitoring, but there's not very much implementation of the laws. In this period, we just start to see everyone is like nervous about the rise of Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro comes in and starts hammering away at the state institutions that involve this. Well, and at the same time, of course, there's massive exports. As you can see here, China takes over. Europe is sort of middles around there and East Asia, but not very much. And you can see that the production goes up. There are other problems that emerge with this, and you'll see I'm going to go through in a minute some of the politics of this, and I realize I have to start talking more quickly. One is that, and this is Javinder's work, which is that the role of the forest in the carbon economy starts to get kind of iffy. One thing that isn't talked about very much is the sort of development sand front coming to white sand forests, white sand soils. These are peat, and these are areas with really poor resilience, and also they burn endlessly, as similar to forests in Indonesia. This is also an area in which there's very little not land classification, but in a sense, very little control over the land. So in essence, it's an open commons. And it's exactly the area through which the Amazonian Belt and Road is about to go forward. And this is along the improvements of the Manaus-Mantua Road, Dr. Freud, call your office. And of course, the larger infrastructure question. Well, one of the things is when we hit more in deforestation, we forego emissions. Javinder has talked a lot about that. This is where I'd like you to take a look at. What you see here is these are hydromorphic podzols. These are these peat soils. This is an area that is actually under the increasing pressure. It's going to come under increasing pressure. And the other thing is it sort of overlays with an area that that's public lands that haven't been allocated. And so what this means is that you have this unfortunate development front in landscapes that really are not very sustainable under any form of agriculture that we practice, and certainly not the forms that are being promoted at this juncture, and also that are where the agriculture won't be sustainable, but also where the carbon emissions will be extraordinarily high. And then, let's see, the other thing I wanted to point out as we go along here is that also there's been a shift from public to private funding. So instead of being able to control through access to credit, there's now other forms of credit that are, whether it's hedge funds or retirement, sovereign wealth funds, or the industries themselves, Monsanto and so on. And also under COVID, essentially the capacity to regulate is gone. The other thing that is important to keep in mind too is that with the US and Chinese fight over tariffs, what that has done is it's really given an extraordinary spike into the value of agro-industrial products coming out of Amazonia or South America more generally. I'm sorry, but this is so fuzzy, but also there's a huge amount of infrastructure development going on, the COSI plan stuff, which as we know is going to have quite a bit of effect. These are, some of it is sort of hydrovias, that is using rivers, changing the rivers, but also a lot of road building going on as well. So this infrastructure question becomes really important, and you can start to see if you take it down how dense these things become. And I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but the other thing is once you start to put that infrastructure in, you start to get a lot of deforestation, even in protected areas, and that the protections especially don't work because of the politics and policies of Jair Bolsonaro. You've been great, you're probably yearning to get to the pub is before 10 o'clock, I think. So let me go through this. There's no more demarcation of native indigenous lands. And also there's a concern and concerted effort now to allow mining on indigenous lands. And so this is going to be an important thing. the management of these systems, the management of indigenous and protected areas has now shifted. It isn't the Ministry of Agriculture, it was under discussion then. This policy is now in assimilationist. It's not in multiple modernities or independence or autonomy. It's indigenous people want to be human. And so if they want to be citizens, they have to be citizens like Bolsonaro. There's been a lot of degazetting of conservation areas. So in areas where there was illegal clearing, no longer then have a conservation function. So might as well transfer to the deforester. There's already been an amnesty for already cleared areas in conservation areas of lots of types, since if you cleared them before 2012, and of course you can sort of make that up. There's been a rush to regularize titles of cleared lands at all sizes. Environmental budgets have been cut. You have this militarization of IBAMA, which is the environmental agency, and Amazonian stuff has all been placed under the Vice President, General Hamilton Mourão, and all the directorates up there have been placed, except for two, have been placed under military control, military men who manage these bureaucracies. Woe to the INPE director who comes up with bad news. The first one gets kicked out, the second one comes up, well, there's a little more deforesting, and you know, that's it. And also the idea of moving the deforestation monitoring away from INPE and its public accountability into private. Both INBio, this is the Conservation Institute, and IBAMA are threatened. There's also, their budgets are cut so massively, and the ending of environmental crimes as a concept. And also fast tracking through other kinds of projects, defunding of the scientific organizations, drastic university cuts. So if we think back from an earlier time where science was going to march hand in hand with policy, and even the first round of the military was military developmentalism was very much linked to questions of states of knowledge and positivism and using knowledge to guide the forms of development. Now we really just have rule by social media. So let me just, and this just gives you an idea of what's going on. The number of inspections down. I think this is important to realize that the internationalization of capital into Brazil's rural production area has meant very massive amounts of loss, very significant loss of control of one of the, what had been a very important lever for controlling or minimizing deforestation. And boy, I could just go on for hours, but let me, just to get to the end of this here, Brazil wants to get out of the Paris Accords. Blairo Maggi says, don't do it. If we do that, none of the Europeans will ever go along with this. All the deforestation right now is threatening the Mercosur. So as a Amazonia, as a geopolitical and political economic question is now moving very much to the front. The idea of Biblia, Boi, and Balas is the sort of motto of the new coterie. It's, let me go back. It's Bible, beef, and bullets. So in a certain sense, going back to a kind of conservative, white supremacist kind of idea, cattle as being the sort of mechanism through which land is appropriated and has been for 500 years. And of course, bullets. The other thing is the rise of COVID-19 as a justification for flouting laws and not implementing them. The other is, of course, the question of state capture and the trope of the new authoritarianism, which is marked by traditional morality in numbers of things, marketization, and decline of the public sphere as a concern of the state. So I'm getting to the end here, and you can just sort of see what's going on. The point of last year, of course, was that the burning was so extreme that it made, darkness at noon, actually at 4, in Sao Paulo. Those of us who live in California are used to orange skies, not black skies, but this gives you an idea of how extreme this burning is becoming. Forest defenders are still out there, but being a forest defender is now one of the most dangerous occupations. It used to be being a labor organizer would be one way to get a bullet, but now it's becoming, if you are a forest defender, whether peasant, indigenous, or anything else. Well, you're probably going, when will she shut up? Minerva's owls fly at dusk. So we'll know what all of this means when it's over. But these are burrowing owls. You can see that they're in a charred landscape, and that their look at us is very accusatory. And as I think Lenin once said, we may not have much to discuss with the future, but the future will have a lot to discuss with us. So on that note, I close my lecture and look forward to your comments. So I probably went a little over time, but there was a lot to cover. All right, Yavinder, I see you're back.
Thank you. So sorry, I had a bit of an internet problem for about 5 minutes there, so I did disappear, but I'm back at a different location. So perhaps, Susanna, if you stop sharing your screen, we can open this up to...
I'm stopping to share right now. That's it. It's over. I'm not sharing anymore.
Great. So now I'll... thank you. That was terrific. Such a fantastic overview of 40 years plus of history in Amazonia.
Probably more than you wanted. Wouldn't it be nice just to have a nice decade? But no.
but so certainly gloomy in some parts, but fascinating. So I'd like to open the floor to questions. So if anyone has a question, what I suggest you do is use the chat facility to propose questions. I'll just indicate that you want to ask a question, and then I can, from that, help curate the answers and chair the process of asking questions.
So Antonio Ferraz wants to know whether it's recorded. Oh, here's Marcos.
Yes, it is recorded. Yeah. So okay, well, I'll just kick off while a few questions pile up in chat.
Okay.
So Susanna, what you've described has been a gloomy trend, alarming in the last few years, and clearly some of these changes are more structural over decades, and some of them are particularly exacerbated by the last few years under Bolsonaro. So if let's take a scenario, so if Bolsonaro loses power in the next few years and we revert to a different president, how quickly do you see aspects of this changing, or how much do you see many of these being embedded in longer term trends and structural problems in Amazonia?
Well, I think, and many of you in the audience would probably agree, which is that the impacts of deforestation are not going to be easily to recuperate. And then, as you know, there's all this debate over whether there's going to be a tipping point in Amazonia. And remember that it's not entirely clear, and that the pressure points are coming onto areas that are particularly vulnerable, both for human institutional reasons and for ecological reasons. Those white sand soils and what's called there Caatinga. So it's complicated. I think the ecological things will be difficult to recuperate, although you do have these great stories about, like, acai. Practically every other corner in Los Angeles has a little acai bar where you can go and get acai bowls and stuff like that, but that's California. But the point is that you do have some of these things like Brazil nuts, and it seems like they seem so trivial, but they do work in terms of niche economies and forest economies, and they're quite successful. So, and there are other models like that. The problem is that those niche products right now are sort of, there hasn't been that much, in terms of institutional rents, there hasn't been much research on them, and there isn't much credit for them. And then things like the Amazon pilot project, the Swiss and the German just pulled out their money was $80 million for these kind of more experimental programs because of the deforestation questions. So that was one of these contingent funding kinds of things where if you were not going to go with environmental norms, you would lose your funding. Another thing that I think is really worrisome that I didn't talk about is that there really is a gold rush going on, in part because I'm not sure if it was last week, but recently gold was selling at $2,000 an ounce for a number of reasons. And so that's been pushing the gold dynamics, and particularly in the Peruvian areas, Colombia and Ecuador, as well as in like that Tapajos Basin. So, and a new front is in Amapá. Well, the problem is, you know, that it tears up the riparian forest, but more severely worrisome is the mercury that goes in. Now, when you start to dam up rivers that have a lot of mercury in them, it becomes very dangerous to open, if you decide later you want to get rid of those dams. We have this problem here in our own Indian country, in the Klamath and Yurok areas here. I was just there last summer. It seems like it was yesterday, like either yesterday or the Pleistocene. And they're getting ready to try and move these dams off so that they can get the free migratory flow. But the problem is that you have all these heavy metals and toxic things that when you do open them up, they are very polluting for a period of time. So that's one issue about pollution. And the other is glyphosate, which is, it's nice if you're a genetically modified soybean, but it kind of kills everything else. So you're having, and even though they aver that it won't kill people or it's not a carcinogen, Bayer has several $billion of funds available to fight this in the courts and also to pay people off. So there's a pollution problem that's going as well. Now, so there's a lot of things that can come up. One is that I think it's easier to ruin and break institutions than to build them again. And the other thing is that you lose institutional memory and so on. But there also have been, the social movements haven't entirely gone away. And the indigenous populations are especially activated now. In Geneva last fall, they were all over the place talking with everyone. So it's not clear whether that translates into international policy, but it's somewhat problematic. The other thing is that the issues of Mercosur, which is the loss of a very, is not a trivial thing. So the question is, where are the levers of power? And I think we haven't quite figured out where those are. Some of them are very local and some of them are international, but the way that they operate is very different. And the power configuration is very different because of the finance, the change in the nature of finance of production, the nature of finance of infrastructure, which is going ahead quite rapidly, and then the kind of incapacity of local operators to work very well under conditions of COVID. So, so there we go. I'll shut up now and let other people ask questions.
Okay. Okay, great, thank you. We have a few questions piling up there. So when people ask a question, can I encourage you, if you don't mind, to switch on your camera as well as your mic, so that it's nice to put a face to the question and have a bit of a bit more sort of human contact in this format. So the first question was from Marcos. Marcos, do you want to ask your question? And also introduce yourself as well. It's nice to know where you're from. And
hi, Marcos.
Marcos, are you there?
Marcos, you're muted. Mute. You're muted.
Maybe I have to do my settings. Let me just check my security settings.
Yeah, can you let him?
Sorry about this. Just trying to find that setting. Okay, you should be okay. Marcos, you should be able to unmute.
Yes, now if you
Hi, Marcos.
Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Marcos Colom. I'm speaking from Tallahassee, Florida. I'm a professor here at the Florida State University. And thank you for doing this workshop and this series. And thanks, Susanna, for the nice dialogue here with this particular point is that really also important to get to know more about this. Susanna, I would like to talk to you about this particular aspect of China in the Amazon. It's something that has been, drive my attention for quite some time since I was doing their filming. I witnessed firsthand a lot of things there. I have a trip planned to China to finish a film about, which is my sequence film about Fort Land, tracing all the process of the soy getting to China. But also I have been noticed that China, as you mentioned, this China double shock you mentioned in your presentation, in the 90s, there's this rising of the central trading partner. And so there's investors, the way they do not care much about environmental policy, but also the whole dynamic of soy that here in the United States also force them to even, to demand more soy from Brazil, and also consequently, affect a lot of the Amazon. But I also would like the question is, how do you see this? Because as my research has been in this particular matter, I've noticed that China, it's advancing, not necessarily in the soybean, in the agriculture, but also has been the tentacles in so many areas in the Amazon. There is completely regions in the Amazon has been purchased by the Chinese. And even the political influence in the region, they have been financed political, in certain regions in the Amazon has been completely controlled. And if you think about also not only in the Brazilian Amazon, but the other countries that also the China has been expand dramatically. Building bridges, and there's this project now, this big highway that crosses a few countries. And I just would like, if you can what's your feelings, how do you see this movement? Because I think there is a big transformation, which was something, let's say, not naive, but with something very kind of in one direction, now become this vantage points of attacking and controlling segments. As you know, China just bought one of the biggest supply of local food in Brazil, in Paraná. And they're controlling resources in so many fronts, but specifically in the Amazon, how do you see their eyes there,
Well, first of all, I hope you're going to go talk to my former student, Gustavo Oliveira. Put him on your list because he's done a lot of work about China and Brazil. He's a Brazilian married to a Chinese, has lived in China, speaks Mandarin, which so he's going to be a really good source for you. Where I see them, I see mostly that they have been working more in the funding transportation and infrastructure. So that's where the investment comes, and that's also where the state obligation comes. So although Sue Branford, I noticed, is here too, so you might want to, maybe she could weigh in on this. When I was recently in the Peruvian Amazon in Pucallpa, one of the things that was very striking, besides the Russians wanting to take ayahuasca to rediscover their spirituality, which, who knew? It was just full of Ukrainians, but there you are. And Chinese doing timber contracts. So part of it is that there's a very strong drive into the Western Amazon on the part of just getting a lot of the timber to move. And most of that timber is pretty illegal. It moves in illegal circuits. So I'm not really sure, but because it's kind of obscure, it's difficult to track, but there's been quite a bit of work on that timber economy into China. But mostly what one sees is that why would you want to take over the risks of production under conditions of climate change, when actually it's much more interesting to get your mitts on to organize to organize investment and to organize the markets to facilitate them. These infrastructure things over the Andes are not going over the Andes so that they can sell them more easily to San Francisco. You know, that's moving more into the international market. And there's lots of, so the thing, the sort of pulse point, I think, here is to look at the infrastructure. The other thing, of course, is remember that we have emerging petrostates in the Western Amazon, and particularly in Ecuador, which now has basically committed a great deal of its future oil production into the Chinese market. Colombia has done similar things. So part of it is these resource exchanges. The other thing is that although China has a lot of rare earths, and is actually the key owner of rare earths, there are a lot of rare earths in these sort of Andean economies. That lithium, of course, in Bolivia is the sort of jewel in the crown. As Elon Musk puts it, we can coup anybody out who wants to stop us. So that's the world of politics these days. It has a sort of familiar ring to it, actually. So there's a lot of different ways in which it articulates. The other thing is that it doesn't necessarily uniquely articulate with purely Chinese companies, but also has sometimes involvement with state companies, as is the case in Ecuador. So, the answer is I can't give you a very complete sense of this because it's huge. It's across 11 countries. Where they are instrumental is in the support for infrastructure development to move the commodities. The other thing about that we certainly know after Odebrecht is that construction companies and construction projects are very corrupt activities. That is, there's lots of money to be made under the table in these, and it's not for nothing that in sort of large-scale projects that president after president has fallen.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, we'll move on. Thank you, Marcos. We'll move on to the next question. We've got about 4 lined up, so we'll perhaps keep them fairly crisp.
I'll talk less.
Erica, would you like to go?
Hello.
Hi, Erica.
Susanna.
Erica,
How are you? Long time no see.
Yes.
I just saw you like last week or so.
So I'm Erica Berenger, a researcher here in Oxford and Lancaster, working with the impacts of fire and selective logging in the Amazon, and I'm also Brazilian. So this was a great talk, Susanna. Thank you. So a question for you. I'd like to hear your reflections actually on, you know, the conservation of the Amazon has never been a strategy of Brazil as a nation. Some governments have done better than others, and the current one has done, it's abysmal. And it has been promoting a completely dismantling of environmental indigenous institutions. However, this government also brought the Amazon more to light in the media because of its huge impacts, the extremely increase in deforestation rates, the fires, São Paulo getting dark in the middle of the day, like you showed. So do you see that the next government, which might be in 2 years or in 6 years, but do you see that maybe a strategy of any other government getting into power would be to put the conservation of the Amazon in more prominence? Because it's been so, Bolsonaro brought it so much to the media because of its completely dismantling of the environmental institutions?
It's an interesting question. And as you were talking, I was thinking, of course, of my great love, Euclides da Cunha, who said the Amazonian countries would only come in, the South American countries would only come into their history once they understood, once they confronted Amazonia. So he was he was thinking about the geopolitics and the political, but I think that that's true too now, that actually how one addresses the questions of Amazonia are going to be key, not just economic questions, but questions about the form of development in the future. Because the form that's going on now is highly unequal, it's highly environmentally fraught. And if you get that shift, and with climate change, if you start to really get that shift of the Amazonian rains away from the central west and the south, you really are going to massively destabilize a lot of the productive enterprise, as well as two major megacities. So I think that sometimes the world, I refer here to Bruno Latour, who says, well, you know, human history is also made by non-human things. You know, they can be non-human beings, they can be non-human forces. Climate change would be sort of a version of an actant. But maybe Amazonia itself is an actant, as in the coronavirus is definitely an actant. It's completely structuring our worlds now. That's why I'm here and you're all there. Oh, yeah. But the point that I would make is that I think that we will see a lot of destabilization before, which is being sort of enhanced by Bolsonaro and COVID and the sort of economic instability and the flailing states all through Amazonia. The issue is that whether it comes back is going to be complicated. I was thinking more. I happen to be reading a lot about the issues of Colombia, where you have these really strong competing forces. You have an internationalization. You have of these markets, and mostly clandestine and illegal markets. You have attempts at international control. So I'm not quite sure how we get out of this. I think that the Brazilian Amazon actually has sort of more social movement infrastructure that's available to be deployed. And in many ways, I think, oddly enough, Ecuador as well. I'm not so sure right now, because there's an impeachment trial going on in Peru, and Bolivia is blowing up. And Guyana is about to become a petrostate client of Exxon. It's just, you know, and Venezuela is a big mess. So I think that Brazil actually, because of its important history in territorial social movements, might have more of a chance. And also that it's also very skilled at working in the international arena in ways that you don't see so much in the other Amazon countries. So I'm sort of more optimistic about Amazon, the Brazilian Amazon, even as I see it being, you know, fairly, you know, really getting battered on this front. And you just think of a city like Manaus, which, you know, what is it? 1 out of every 300 people is dying of COVID or something. It's very, you know, this is a sort of unregulated COVID experimental space. And so it inhibits the capacity both to deal with the pandemic, but also the capacity to do any kind of regulatory activities. The other thing I would argue too is that the urban space has to start to be thought of as an Amazonian space. And what, you know, right now they're just giant messes. And yet there has been a huge amount of experimental thought about tropical planning, urban planning. And so it's one of these things which is that there's maybe sort of weird opportunities here that we can't see just yet. As I say, I think we didn't quite understand what was going on in that sort of the earthquake period of 1988 to 1990, how much it was shifting. I think we're in another situation like this, and it may be that rethinking the urban story might be interesting. Now, you had those millennial villages, you're putting a lot of infrastructure in the sense of those roads. You could be rethinking about what your urban strategy would be instead of, you know, agro villas or, you know, the sort of entropic urbanization that we tend to see. So I think there's more potential than we than we quite understand just yet. So we just have to, but even though some days I feel very despairing about all of this, on the other hand, there's always the pula do gato in Amazonia. There's always the leap of the cat that you can't really quite figure out where it comes out. And again, I do want to repeat that quote from Euclides da Cunha, which is Amazonians would only come into the countries of Amazonia would only come into their history when they understood Amazonia. And I think this Amazonian ascendance is a really important thing, because now it's the drivers, one of the important drivers of their economies. So they might want to rethink how to go about this.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Thank you, Erica.
Bye, Erica. See you soon.
Okay. Okay, Sue, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, Sue.
Hello. Nice to see you, and thanks very much.
Nice to see you. Gosh, I remember going to like some meat packing plant and then coming to your house in Sao Paulo.
Yeah, well, we've been going around the Amazon for decades now, and I've often heard, oh, Susanna was here the week before. Yes. I was going to ask you about external pressure. I mean, particularly from consumers. I mean, it seems every day now I get some notification that a big bank has said it's going to eliminate deforestation from any kind of loans that it makes. JBS this morning, I think it was, said it was going to eliminate deforestation.
Well, I wouldn't trust a word that JBS said. So, I mean, maybe those other ones, but JBS with its COVID factories in Colorado, please.
I mean, is it all going to be, is it greenwash? I mean, I was very skeptical of the soy moratorium, because when we were traveling in the region then, we could see actually how easy it was for farmers to get by it. So, you know, they planted, or they had cattle on a recently cleared forest and didn't plant the soy till a couple of years later, so they weren't actually technically breaking the soy moratorium. But it does seem to have had some sort of effect in reducing soy production in the Amazon, if only, as you said earlier, diverting it to the Cerrado, which wasn't much of a solution to environmental problems.
Yeah, or those rare Bolivian forests, or the Chaco, it's just nightmarish. But anyway, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, I mean, it's quite difficult to see how outside consumer pressure can have an impact, particularly on this government, because it just seems to, Bolsonaro just seems to sort of dismiss it. But do you think this could be, in the sort of longer term, a way in which we can, or this can help to bring down deforestation in the Amazon?
I don't know. We'll see what happens with Mercosur, because there's reasons for the Europeans not to like Mercosur. Yeah. Either, because then they get cheap meat and cheap soy and so on, and undermine EU producers. So there'll be quite a lot, you know, and deforestation, not having deforestation makes a sort of nice, you know, kind of poetic story about a rather different economic story. And I see you have Roger Casement in the back. So I guess that's one of the things too, which is that one can say, you know, sometimes they make a difference, as Roger Casement sort of did, and sometimes they don't. And it's hard to know. We might say that some companies are more authentically green than others. Right now, what is it? The fund managers of some $2 trillion are saying. But you know, I hardly need to tell you this, since you write about this on a sort of daily basis, that the timber industry, there's so many ways of corrupting the sourcing of these things. And also things like gold, 70% of the gold or 80% of the gold that's processed in Switzerland. But it's not coming from Switzerland, it's coming from the UK. So if you want to start to go off the supply chains, then you know, you have to sort of deal with the problem of the invisibilities that inhere in the supply chains and the sort of giant laundromat. And the other thing is that it may be, they may do, remember that these, and again, I feel like I hardly need to say this to you, but they often are these, have all these LLCs that they can say, well, you know, one part of our operation will deal with it this way. And also I would say that that's mostly the European market, which is, you know, for beef, it's 11%, you know, and it's not a trivial portion, but it's not a massive portion. And, you know, the US isn't going to start buying soybeans from Brazil anytime soon. So then you're in the Asian and Middle Eastern markets, which are, I would say, mostly indifferent to the environmental questions. So my suspicion is that it's not nothing, but it's, I think the economic levers are much different. And remember, Monsanto is now a Chinese company. And they're the ones who do a lot of, you know, you sort of forget, you just get used to the name. And, but you forget that a lot of the funding for this is coming directly from the seed and input supplier companies. And so they're now not based in, they're now not vulnerable to these kinds of pressures. So that's an, I don't mean to, I feel like I'm trying to be kind of upbeat about this, but I think that as you know, it's hard sometimes to be upbeat about it because the machination, it's gotten more complex. And I also believe that there really are truly companies that really want to do the right thing and to help. So they're part of the story, but the other side of the story is pretty big. So in a certain sense, one sort of feels like that the dynamics will have to be more the instability that comes internally. And I've
Okay.
had Jair
Thank
now.
you. So it sounds like okay. So I think you've answered Kasia's question as well. It seems something like
Okay.
question. So we'll just go over to our final question, which is from Connie.
Hi, Connie.
Hi, yeah, this is Connie McDermott at Oxford. I'm a fellow here. Yeah, my question is around, you know, trying to, and as also an American, as I sound, trying to still puzzle about why this populism is taking off like it is. And in trying to understand what's happening in the Amazon, I'm just wondering to what extent it makes sense to see a certain amount of, to see what's happening, at least from a popular perspective, as a kind of backlash against the environmental movement. You know, for example, against past anti-deforestation policies that were sometimes quite regressive. I mean, in the sense of, you know, maybe perceived as not being sensitive to the livelihood needs of farmers in the Amazon. The ways in which, you know, the moratoria, for example, might have been an agreement involving large companies who were able to, you know, in some ways benefit from the moratoria, but smallholders not necessarily. The sort of draconian approach to law enforcement was certainly quite hard on a lot of people. So I'm just wondering, you know, in terms of a time for self-reflection for the environmental movement, if there's, you know, if there's any truth to that. I hear about all these other forces at play, so maybe this is minor, but I don't think it is, because just like in the US, I mean, there's just this upswelling of populism from also people you would think might not benefit from the current government, but certainly are very supportive of it. So I wonder if you had any thoughts about that.
You raise a really good point, and I'm thinking of the book by Arlie Hochschild that you probably know called Strangers in Their Own Land, which is about people who are in these kind of contaminated environments in Louisiana, but you know they're phenomenally Trump supporters. Part of it has to do, and the parallels with Bolsonaro and Trump are not trivial. I mean, you sort of feel like you're being facile when you mention it, but they're not trivial in the sort of reversion to fundamentalism, into the sort of feeling of rage about being overlooked in favor of these Indians and, you know, rubber tappers and so on, these traditional people, while they're still in conditions of really dire inequality. So part of the problem, I think, is that there's this idea that the mobilization of resources is going to benefit everybody. You know, this is the main, that big narrative, you know, about rising growth, and a rising tide lifts all ships. The reality is that it's that nationalist project for Amazonia that always sort of seems to override looking at more carefully the issues of inequality, and how inequality is going to be getting worse because of the COVID thing. So the answer is, I think that your point is correct, that first of all, a lot of environmentalists come in very ham-fisted, and you know, worrying, you know, they haven't really thought through how these other kinds of things are operating. The other thing is the issues of access regimes. There's been wonderful work in the estuary, and also in near Pucallpa, on how much urban dwellers use forest resources. And so in a certain sense, as those become privatized or become little local parks and stuff, their ability to use them as input, livelihood substitutes, really goes down. The other thing is, again, I think that the role of timber, gold, and coca in these livelihoods for the poor people, the people whose incomes have really been trashed in these regions for a number of reasons, whether it's access regimes or just the general failures of the model and the levels of corruption, mean that, you know, they're the ones that are going to get smacked around on these environmental things. It's not the people sitting in Lima or sitting in Sao Paulo. And so their engagement they're being criminalized in these systems that are, you know, the difference between legal and illegal in Amazonia right now is such a fungible boundary. But the point is that they often feel kind of criminalized, you know, which is, I'm just trying to get by here. And again, the Ibama went after all these small farmers who were deforesting more than their allotted area in Amazonia, which was quite small, whereas they were sort of leaving these large holders who had more area to deforest loose. So there's a lot, I think there's a lot of resentment. I think it comes from also recognizing some kinds of land rights and not recognizing others, the problems of inequality and the role in terms of the income generation and income support that a lot of things that are criminalized within the environmental movement do for small farmers. And then, of course, Bolsonaro, you know, with Biblia, Balas, and Boy, you know, those are the kind of, you know, those are these big moving symbols for these regions. You know, the ability to protect yourself, the prestige associated with cattle, even if you just have a few, and the importance of, you know, as we know, the rise of evangelical religions in Latin America is really high. So Bolsonaro and his coterie are very important evangelical influencers. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. You know, that there's this stuff working at the ideological level in ways that I think also reflect some of what we see here, which is marginalized rural people whose engagement in the economy has been kind of criminalized or disparaged in the environmental movement, even though it's really a problem. You know, I mean, that's the other thing, is like, it's not nothing, you know. That gold mining is really a problem and will be a problem for a long time. So I don't know whether that actually answers your question, but I think that you're correct about how easy it is now to demonize things, because they're not really talking so much about environmental justice. They're talking more about climate change. And so the justice issues and inequality issues have dropped a bit out of the discourse. But we'll see what happens, because boy, stuff is coming down the pipeline.
Okay, thank you, Susanna. Thank you, Connie. So, okay, I think it's probably time to wrap up. So just thank you, Susanna, as well as the depth of your perspective and experience. You're also just this encyclopedia of amazing facts. There's so many nuggets of information, and everything you say is absolutely fascinating just to hear you and to pick up all these amazing little nuggets and pieces of information about the Amazon. As I said, I've recorded this and we'll make this available on initially through my YouTube channel, and I'll send links to Susanna and others to share and distribute it as well. So anybody who's interested in our series, feel free to join in every week. For the next few months, we have a seminar on a particular topic. So finally, I'd like us to thank Susanna. I'd encourage you all to unmute so you can actually have a bit of applause going there. And take up a video.
Yes, the applause. I'm just sitting here. All I'm getting is my dog shaking his head, going, isn't it time for a walk? What's the deal here? We're talking for hours.
Non, en plus, c'est débile parce que sur Zoom,
So we have all these,
t'as mis les autres.
Ouais. Great. So thank you, Susanna, and good night, everybody. And see you next week.
Ciao. I'm leaving. Oh, leave meeting. Bye-bye. Great to see everybody.
Likewise.
Likewise.
All right.